All right, here we go. I'm going to move around a little bit, and we're actually live streaming this because I know that she's on there. So, but she's only going to see the map. You're only going to see the maps. I mean the pictures. But I'm going to talk. And so, but you don't need to see me anyway. You want to see the pictures. And so, hopefully she'll pick that up. And so, good to see everybody. We are right in the second class of looking at various photos and maps in historical places and such of Israel. Last week, the place circled up on this map is where we were at, and we were right along the coast. I'm going to wrap that up, and then we're going to move, and I'll show you the map here in a moment where we're moving to. We're making a big circle from that side of Israel to the top, and then all the way down to the desert, and then back up. So we'll make a big full circle there over the coming months. This is only lesson 2, and I'm only able to show like 60 to 70 pictures each week. And so, as I mentioned, between Jordan and Israel, she's taken about 3,000 pictures, and so, won't be showing all of them. And so, we'll be here for months and months, but just things that I think is helpful for us as we study God's Word. And then some of the discoveries that I think increases. So again, our thought here is to help us see this in our minds when we read Scripture, and we're going to read different places all through the Old and New Testament, and then also just increase our faith to see that, wow, like that rock that I showed last week that I'm going to show at the beginning of the next set of Caesarea, and finding Pontius Pilate's name on there. That's only 1961. 1961, they, archaeologists weren't even sure Pontius Pilate lived, except for the fact that it's in the Bible. And so you'll see that often. Serious archaeologists follow the Bible, right? I mean, they use the Bible as a tool to help them in their digs, because the Bible has all this information in it from time. And so they know often cities exist, they just haven't found them yet. So they'll roughly know, oh, there's this city there, and they hope to find it someday. And so that's what archaeologists do. They'll use a tool like the Bible, of course, to help that out. And so anyway, we should get started. I'm going to do a couple of things here tonight. I'm actually going to show a little video. Hopefully, we'll see if it comes through. I'm trying to adjust the sound on it to kick out the background noise. Right whenever we started filming this, of the speaker speaking the Sermon on the Mount in the original language for us, a whole big giant group of Koreans moved in, and they're pretty loud. And so that's just the way it works. And so most of you know, if you travel a lot, if you're in religious kind of places, you got Koreans to deal with, because Korea has actually turned quite Christian, as far as, many big mega church type movement things going down there. And secondly, there's always a Chinese group, and you know how the Chinese groups operate. Maybe you don't, but the way it works, and I know this is very cultural, but typically if you have a big group of Chinese tourists, as soon as the tour guide opens the bus door, they go in 100 directions, and he's constantly having to go, come back. Anyway, it's just a part of that Asian thing. But here we go. Last time we looked at, and I'm going to wrap up last week. So this is from last week. We were in right at the top part. You can see at the tip of the circle there, it's called Acre, or here it's going to be ACCO. There's lots of different names for it. Acre is kind of the Middle Ages Crusader and what it is today. And so just a reminder that Israel has layer upon layer of history. And so you guys feel free to jump in or comments, or I know some of, like I said last week, some of you have been to these places too, and so jump in if I'm missing something or whatever. But you can see the little AKKO right above. Remember, Carmel is that little place that juts out there. Tel Aviv is in the red on the right side. And if you go up there to that acre, that was the last stronghold of the Crusaders. And so I'll show just a couple of pictures of that because that is a historical part of what's happened here. It roughly 1190 to 1291 when the Mamelukes kicked them out for good. But you basically got Richard the Lionhearted at the beginning of that, all the way through to the end when they finally get kicked out, and that's the end of it. But for the 100+ years that they were there in that location, and then of course before that also, they of course built a giant fortress. And you'll see some of those fortresses in different parts of Israel. And Acre has one of them. And so there's kind of like on the coast, and even on the coast, these are 900-year-old formations of, what they built. And so big, giant, Crusader fortress that they built during that time period. And so that was, of course, a very important thing as far as preserving some of these sites. So generally speaking, let's think back through history for a moment. So we've got Palestine being off and on under Egypt's control. And Egypt was a predominant force, all while Assyria and Babylon and Persia and the Romans, right? You got Egypt down here. And Egypt off and on is controlling Canaan. And where did Abraham come from? Way up in the top of the Fertile Crescent. So God tells him, hey, I want you to go down there. And so Abraham leaves his... Oh, I just lost it. Nope, I bet I'm losing the battery. And so he... Nope, it's still showing. Anyway, it's me. And so he sojourns down Canaan, right? And he ends up in Egypt for part of it, and Beersheba, and we're going to see Beersheba eventually. It's a great archaeological site where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all were at. And so Abraham, though, gets down there, right? And Egypt, off and on, is controlling that area. And then the Canaanites, of course, Jericho and all the other Canaanites, bunch of ites, right? Jebusites and Perizzites, and on it goes. And so they're all controlling that. And then the Israelites take over, right? Sorta. And you got the Philistines, and you got the Israelites, and you got the Moabites and the Ammonites, and there's just on it goes. And then Israel, of course, gets conquered by those major empires. And then Rome takes over, and, Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And then that, of course, gets split into a north and south, Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And that goes on for 300 years. About 63 BC, Ptolemy the Great from Rome takes over Palestine. And then it's Rome's control for quite a while, all the way through Rome and through the Byzantine Empire, right, until the Muslims and the Persians start taking over in the 600s. They wipe out anything that's Christian, pretty much. And that's one reason why it's so difficult, because they did destroy a lot of ruins, destroy a lot of things and turn them into ruins, but not always, because some things were already covered up. Or an earthquake. Earthquakes are good, because then the Muslims are like, it's already been destroyed by an earthquake. We won't fool with it, but everything's still there. And then, of course, the Crusaders try to come in and take over, right, and form a new Christian kingdom, which they're off and on successfully able to do, but then they finally get kicked out, and the Muslims are there, and then what takes over? The Ottoman Empire, and then eventually the British kick the Ottoman Empire out. And we already saw that in the big battles that took place there in the Armageddon, the last big battle, 34 major battles at least. The big one that I didn't really get a chance to mention was, of course, the one that occurred right at the end of World War I between the Ottoman Empire and Great Britain, and Allenby was the general, and he did a decisive victory over the Ottoman Empire right there in that same valley. That's had all those battles for all those thousands. It's where Pharaoh Necho killed Josiah. It's where, countless major battles have occurred all throughout the ages. The last one was the British kicking out the Ottoman Empire, right there in that same valley. And then, of course, the British, of course, are at rule. The British do what the British do, which is rule very poorly, in my opinion, in a lot of these places, because they don't understand the culture, and that's why we have the mess we're in today in the Middle East. You can blame the British. But anyway, because they don't listen to anybody on the ground. And so, anyway, you end up with this big mess of Israel and Palestinians and Muslims and everybody and their dog. And so, maybe the British are too nice. I don't know. Maybe it's the other way. I don't know. They're cruel in some ways and too nice in others. Does that make sense? And so it's certainly the way it worked in India. They were way too nice about some things, so they end up having to have a big civil war between the Muslims and the Hindus, but they're way too cruel in other ways. So it's just not understanding the culture, right? That's the bottom line. But back to this. And so you can see where these, this is like the halls of the hospital they built there. And this is 1200 AD. They have these giant hospital wings. These guys, the knights, and they did their thing. And so there's always an escape tunnel. There's tunnels all over Israel, of course. And the Crusaders had their tunnel. This was one of the tunnels. They had an escape tunnel from their big banquet hall that went out and away from the big fortress in case they ever needed to escape. And so you go down this thing, and anyway, she'll, of course, probably has to close her eyes right now because she's having flashbacks to this stuff because she doesn't like some of this. But Michael thoroughly enjoyed it. As we see here, he's just like, yeah, oh yeah. Anyway, that's the big hallway that tunnel leads out of. It's like a secret tunnel, trapdoor tunnel thing you leave. And big, giant halls with these big columns. You can tell it's Crusader. They've got those ribs that are going, up. It's all like Crusader stuff, Crusader built. Quite impressive. But anyway, that was back then. And then I ended with us moving over to the Sea of Galilee with the Church of the Multiplication and this church building that was built during the Byzantine time with these great mosaics. And, as I've talked about, and I'm going to show you some of them tonight because I think it's important. I take baptistry pictures all over the world. And so what do you take pictures of? Some people take pictures of flowers, and I take pictures of baptistries. But anyway, we all have to do our thing. And so, but when you look at a baptistry, you can just about peg the date. So it's a useful dating tool. Because you start going, okay, this is in the shape of a, so it's a baptistry that's in the shape of a cross. And so, we start going, oh, this is a pretty early gig that they started doing. Obviously, they would stand there in the middle in the water, and then basically they'd get dunked, right? They just, then back up. And, they had, it's immersion baptism, 400-ish AD. We'd peg that baptistry and sit there. Oh, goodness, the building that was originally with it kind of got destroyed and covered up with dirt, including this, and nobody thought about it until the 1800s, and they discovered it and uncovered all the dirt, and they're like, well, yeah, it must be a church building. How do we know it's a church building? Well, number one, there's mosaics all over the place that are Christian, but number two, there's a big baptistry, and that makes it Christian. So there we go. That happens to be inside that church building, so the only thing original there is the mosaic floor. So it's always peculiar in my mind to be walking on something that's 1,600 years old. I'm always like, oh. But it's just a testimony to how well they built things. Can you imagine your floor still being able to be walked on 1,600 years from now? Pretty good technology to think that is still good to go. And a part of that is the testimony of the Roman concrete that we talked about before, but pretty impressive that floors like that can last that long. One of the oldest synagogues in the Commonwealth is in Cochin, India. And it's a synagogue, and Sheila and I went in there, many years ago in the 90s. And it's built like 900 AD, this synagogue. It's the oldest synagogue, matter of fact, in the Commonwealth countries, Great Britain. And so the floor is like 1,100 years old. It is all porcelain tiles from China that they put down on the floor in 1100 AD. And you're like, 900 AD. So the floor is 1100 years old, and it's all from China, these Chinese porcelain tiles. It was a big secret, and they were the world's best at that stuff. And they make you wear socks to walk in there, but you're just like, oh, how much is each of these tiles? They don't even realize. That must be 20,000, 20,000, 20,000, 20,000. Anyway, because, how much would you pay for porcelain tile that's in good shape, that's 1,100 years old from China? Anyway, they don't even know what they've got. Anyway, there's I showed this because it's just so cool to see that. You're like, wow, that stuff is it's in pretty good shape. And, it has the little, this is where they believe Jesus did the feeding of the 5,000. So they have they believe that in the Byzantine Empire around 400 AD. They put this little stuff in and off they went. And then later on, of course, the Persians came and destroyed the building, but, they didn't care about the floor, and so it just got all covered up with dirt. And so there it is. And that was our meal there at the end. Okay, that was last week. Okay, here we go. Oh, are we going to get it? Lance, are you back there? Nope, he's not back there. Let me see if I can get that video to show. If I can. Oh, it is playing on that one? Good. He's going to read the Sermon on the Mount.
Like this from Matthew 5 from 1 to 10.
So he's in Matthew 5, verse 1.
And when he saw the crowd, he came to the mount and sit over there, and his disciples came to him. And then he opened his mouth and teach them. Ashrei. Ashrei, which means blessed. Ashrei. Ashrei aniyei ruach, ki lahem malchut shamayim. Blessed are the poor in spirit, because they have the kingdom of heaven. Ashrei avilim, ki hem yenucham. Blessed are the mourn, because they are comforted. Ashrei anavim, ki hem hayirshu et haaretz. Blessed are the modest, because they are inherited the land. אשרי הרעבים וצמאים לצדקה, כי הם ישבעו. Blessed are the people after charity, because they are going to heaven. אשרי רחמנים, כי הם ירחמו. Blessed are the mercy people, because they are comforted. אשרי ברי לבב, כי הם יחזו את אלוהים. Blessed are the honest ones, because they are going to see God. אשרי רודפי שלום, כי בני אלוהים יקראו. Blessed are the people after peace, because they are called the sons of God. אשרי הנרדפים על צוואר צדקה, כי להם מלכות שמיים. Blessed are the people who chase for their charity, because they are going to get the kingdom of heaven. A beautiful.
It's just interesting because we sometimes got to remember that Jesus, of course, was not speaking English. And they were out there all doing their thing in Hebrew and Aramaic. And, Aramaic is a language, obviously Hebrew is the Hebrew, it's the Jewish language, but all of this has got those roots going back into the original languages over there, Phoenician, etc. And Aramaic is because the Israelites were taken captive over to Babylon. And that's where they learned Aramaic, and they brought that back so that by the 1st century, they're still speaking the other language. That's because they were in Babylonian captivity. And so nowadays, of course, they're speaking back to the Hebrew because that's what they want to do. So here we go a little bit with, let me try to get now where I'm at. Okay, this is last week's. Now let me pull us up to this week's, and we can get started. And so, if I can find it, which I should be able to. There we go. So, that was what I mentioned last week. This is the rock that has, it's hard to see it, so it's translated over there. To the people of Caesarea Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And that's that stone that was found in 1961 was the actual first time that Pontius Pilate was found in writing in a Roman Empire location outside the Bible. And so, obviously, it has historical significance because who is this Pontius Pilate? Well, now, of course, they know who he was and what he was doing, not just in the Bible. And so that's really important. Okay, here's where we're going tonight. Tonight, we're going to swing over to the Sea of Galilee and spend our time with Jesus now, around where he was born and where he lived and did most of his ministry. So most of his ministry is centered around Capernaum, which is right there at the top of the Sea of Galilee. So you see Capernaum there on the left. That's the map of Israel in the New Testament. The one on the right is today. And so we're going to be traveling all around that Sea of Galilee. We'll make a big loop around the Sea of Galilee, and we'll hit some of those places. Another reason I bring this up is you can see Nazareth. What happened in Cana? The first miracle, right? First recorded miracle of his wedding, of the wedding, water into wine. You can see Tiberias there at the edge of the Sea of Galilee. Right above that is Magdala. That's where Mary Magdalene's probably from. Then you got Capernaum, and then you go across, and then notice that there's the Decapolis. And so the Decapolis, of course, are Greek cities. We'll talk about them in a little bit, but those are also very important, kind of post-first century also, and so we'll talk about those. You can see way up at the top there on the right, across the Jordan to the east, the Golan Heights, and then you can see the little Undaf zone, that's the UN zone. It's kind of the frontier up there, and I'll show you a picture or two. We did go up there into the UN camp area just briefly, and I'll show you a couple of pictures there. And then we'll swing back down and make our way down towards Jerusalem. And so that's where we are today. And so, in other words, we're looking at this whole area around Sea of Galilee. We're going to hit Caesarea Philippi. You see it at the top there. You see Mount Hermon. We actually went all the way up to Mount Hermon there at the base of Mount Hermon. And then we came back down to Caesarea Philippi. So we'll show that and the importance of all of that and how it relates to the Bible, of course, and then centered around the Sea of Galilee tonight. And so we're basically walking right where Jesus spent the bulk of his ministry. And the cool thing about that is, so often, do we know the rock that Jesus stood on when he preached his sermon on the Sermon on the Mount? No. But we know where the place is at. So the hill's still there. It's just, where did he stand exactly? Who knows, right? And so that part doesn't really matter. So now if you're looking at the Sea of Galilee, remember all of this is along the Rift Valley, so we're actually below sea level even at the Sea of Galilee. And Capernaum's right there at the top, and that's where Jesus is going to spend a lot of time. Who else is there at Capernaum? Peter. And so Peter's relatives, and Peter is there. And so that's a big deal because you've got the fishing industry and all the stories of fishing. Well, it's all going to be up there. They're going to be going out into the Sea of Galilee from up there. And so they're going to spend their time right up there in that north shores. And so Jesus does a lot of stuff up there, of course. That is the hill of the Sermon on the Mount, looking just across the way there and seeing that. Here's kind of another perspective. We're at the base and we're looking up. And of course, that's kind of hard to see, but you can see that it's really just an amphitheater. And in an amphitheater, where would you speak? At the bottom. So chances are he spoke at the bottom. But of course they have the church building and all the stuff that's been built up at the top because that's what you're going to do. But you're going to speak at the bottom, and the crowds are just going to be lining the kind of the natural amphitheater, because then, especially with Sea of Galilee right behind you, and so the wind's going to take your voice up that amphitheater because the wind is just blowing in from the sea and right up through this natural amphitheater. So it's when you stand there, you go, hello. No, you stand there and go, wow, this is it. You could see it. You could see that it's a natural amphitheater. if you're standing at the bottom and speaking up. So there's Sea of Galilee, of course. They got these little boats, these wood boats that go out there, and we, of course, rode out there on the wood boat. And for the most part, that's pretty good, for the most part. Like everything, clash of cultures. We get on the boat, and for a while they're playing, nice Christian music, different Christian music stuff from, English. But then right at the end, what did they do? What? God bless the USA. And you're like, you just ruined it, dude. No tip for you. Anyway, but, because it's just weird. Like, only Jesus moment. You've taken me out of it. But one of the most important finds of the Sea of Galilee was just a few years ago, and it really, they found a boat that was immersed in the mud, and it's first century boat. And so those kind of things are exciting. And so they have that boat now on display, and it's just like, okay, yeah, first century boat. What those first century, they look like that. And they know it looks like that because they found an intact boat. And they took them several weeks, of course, because it's in the mud and the water. And, as soon as you get it out of the water, the wood would disintegrate. So they did the whole thing to preserve that boat. And now they have it on display there. And it's kind of hard to even tell the size of it there, but it's a pretty good size. I mean, multiple men could get in that thing, of course. So you can imagine the apostles in a boat like that, and Jesus comes walking on the water. And, if the waves are crashing up a couple of feet, yeah, that boat may not do it for you. And so, the wood, with the sails. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Before you get on one of the wood boats out on the Sea of Galilee and go out, you can go in and see this, what they call it the Jesus boat, because it is dated to first century. And so it's kind of interesting to see that they finally found there at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee. And so, there's the boat we rode on, and then you go out into the sea, and yeah, that's always good. And so it's kind of hard to see in this picture. Sea of Galilee, though, is pretty good size. I mean, it's a big lake. You can see, of course, across the both sides, but you can't quite see all the way down because it is multiple miles. Hazy. The haze comes from Saudi Arabian dust. That, the desert in Saudi Arabia is big and definitely below the world. Come on, fix it. There we go. And so from, you see angles of the shore. This one here is looking, so Shill and I, a couple of years ago, were on, that's over in Jordan, and I'll show another picture of some of those places here in a little bit, but that's where the pigs ran down. And so Jesus was on that side, and he did the pigs thing, and the pigs ran down into the Sea of Galilee. He's all over that top of Sea of Galilee there. Capernaum, the ruins of Capernaum look like this. And so you've got, lots and lots of things Jesus did in Capernaum, right? And people. And so they have since, you see the little black flying saucer? That's a church building that they've built. They were very careful to build it on concrete stilts. And so all the stuff underneath is still there. You can see kind of the big white-ish area. That's the Capernaum synagogue. That was originally there with Jesus' time, and then the Jews built kind of a Byzantine one era, 300 AD, right on top of the one that Jesus. So you got the layers there. All the black rock that you can see in between, that's just in the first century town. And so again, it's like, did Jesus walk into that house? Well, probably. And he certainly walked all those main roads because it's just that little fishing village. But which one did he actually stay in? And which one was actually Peter's? Who knows, right? And so they, of course, think they know which one was Peter's house because tradition says that Peter's house became a church building, and then the Byzantines by 300 AD built a bigger church building right at the spot. And they know where that spot's at, which is underneath that dome now. But really, do you know, it doesn't have Peter lived here scrawled on it or anything. And so that's the synagogue. And so, you know, the various times that Jesus would have stood up and read when it was his turn, right? He'd have been reading in a place that looked like that. The columns, of course. The Jews built their synagogues and stuff. What was the prevalent, like, look of the day? Well, it's going to be Greek, Roman style. And so they built their synagogues like that. And so you have the columns, and only difference is you'll find, you know, they're not going to make images of idols, but they are going to have like little rosebuds or, you know, various things that you go, oh, okay, that's Jewish. And then, of course, the Christians did a lot of other, you know, the Christians aren't going to do idols, but they are going to do a lot of little whats, crosses and fishes and, you know, all the things we could all think of if we were doing that sort of thing. And so, just another example, it was a huge synagogue. Capernaum had a pretty good-sized synagogue. So, first century, what did the Jews not do in the first century in their synagogue worship? It's kind of a misnomer sometimes. We tend to take some of the things that's done today and think that's the way it was back then, but it wasn't. So we tend to, like in our little felt stories, right, when you're in Bible class and you're 12 or 10, or, well, no, felt would be first, second grade. They'll have like all the men there listening, but actually in the first century in synagogues, men and women worshiped in the synagogue together. That's a later several centuries invention. Jews worshiped together in the first century. Wasn't until years later, and I don't remember the year now. That just shows you, you see the dark rock? All that dark rock is the original, like definitely first century synagogue. And so that's just, you know, Jesus was there, and this is kind of near the entrance to the synagogue, and him and the rest of the disciples would have been walking in there, you know, lots of times, right? Because that's what you did. You went to synagogue. That's a bunch of houses. You know, it's just streets and houses, and it's all, you know, it's all that's left, of course, is so many feet of the houses. They used a black rock. And so that's another thing that's kind of, you know, we always see Jesus like in these little towns, and it's like white walls and everything. And it's like, no, actually a lot of the places it would have been black walls because they had black stone there. And so Jesus would have been walking around where there were like black walls of stone and then wood roofs, right? Or some type of thatched roofs, palm leaf roofs. And so, you know, it's kind of it's got some white in it. Black, white, but definitely dark stone that's used in some of these places. I just think it's cool because where was he at? Well, we don't know where he was, but he had to walk along those lanes because that was the town in the first century. And it's not huge. You can see the Sea of Galilee right behind it. Obviously, they're fishermen. They're all going to go down to the sea and fish in their little boats. And so, and it's a pretty good size fishing village. By the time Capernaum becomes Christian, and it's like 300 AD, and the whole town is now Christian, they built, and this is underneath that big black saucer. There we are, you know, looking off in the distance. Well, underneath the big black saucer, there is a 8-sided building that they know for sure was the Byzantine church in 300-ish AD. And so that's where the church was meeting. And the church by then had built it into an 8-sided. So the theory is that the original first inside area was Peter's actual house. But they don't know, of course. Why 8-sided? Remember the gig? 8-sided is eight's the number for salvation, right? Corresponding to that, Baptism now saves you, not to remove the dirt from, right? But corresponding to what? When Noah and the 8 were saved on the ark. 8's always the number for salvation. Hence, when you go to some place like Florence and you go into the big giant cathedral in downtown Florence, the Duomo there, and you go to the separate baptistry building, how many sides does it have? 8. You don't even have to have a picture of it, right? Because that's the number for the salvation. Anyway, so there we are, kind of standing in front of that thing. And then after you go to something like this, what do you have to do when you've just been to the fishing village? You got to go eat, but we didn't have fish. We had, of course, no. This picture is actually a Syrian meal. So we were with us in a Syrian restaurant, and which looks kind of like the rest of them, right? But there's hummus, and oh man, was that one good? Anyway, there's hummus there, and they get the I don't even know how to say it in English, labna. Oh, it's so good. You know, where they take yogurt and they let it squeeze out until it becomes fresh cheese. Oh, it's one of my favorites. But anyway, and of course pita bread that came out warm, and pickles and carrots and all of that. So this is the road that we traveled on for a little while up there past the UN camp. Both sides have fences. It's kind of hard to tell that that's a fence. And every so often there's a big red sign that says, "Mind, you will die if you cross this fence." So on both sides. So, you know, you stay on the road. And who knows what's out there? It probably is mind, right? Because it's just like, it's like no man's land out there. Anyway, we went down this road and got to this place. It's like a little Syrian village. And they're kind of right there. They're just, you know, what do? And so they're Syrians, and they seem to do their thing. It's like the wild frontier. I always get the feeling of the Wild West. Like, what are they smuggling here? I'm sure many things, but anyway, because, you know, Damascus is just over the hill. But you've got Mount Hermon. The reason I show you this picture and do this is because what is that mountain covered in? It's 9,000 feet mountain, the top of Israel, snow. And so snow becomes water, and water flows down the Jordan into the Sea of Galilee and then on into the Dead Sea. And so this is the main source of water for the Sea of Galilee. It's 15 miles to the north. And there's a spring there, and I'm about to show you, and it's very important, and this is kind of like the highlight of this week's lesson. I want us to get there. So Matthew 16, if you have your Bibles, but you know Matthew 16, but if you have your Bibles, you can turn over there, Matthew 16. This is the only time in Scripture that it is recorded. I mean, there's several verses where it says, and Jesus just went all around the villages around the Sea of Galilee. So we know he traveled all over there, right? I mean, he had 3 years. He spent most of his time up in Galilee. But there's only one chapter where he actually goes to Caesarea Philippi, in this chapter 16. But what happens in Matthew 16? Verse 16. Somebody read it for us. Somebody read Matthew 16, 16 through 18.
Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Barjona, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it."
Okay, so this is the first time the word church is brought up in the New Testament. When Jesus says ecclesia, right? When he says, well, I'm going to build my called out people on what you've just said. So this is the foundation rock of the church, that I am the Son of God, right? That's his point there, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's the foundation stone of the called out group of people. The rock is going to be, right? That's what we're built on. So it's foundation rock. So that Caesarea Philippi, that little time that they went up to Caesarea Philippi and did that is important because and so let me show you that. And so let me kind of get through the pictures here. And so that's the restaurant we ate at that had the Syrian meal, but anyway, Syrians. And then it's the road that we got to get up there to Mount Hermon and to this little village that's up there. And then we started traveling away from there back towards Israel, and you go by, this is called Nimrod. It's a big fortress that the Muslims built against the Crusaders in the 1100, 1200 AD. That's good enough for that. It's the typical big fortress up there. But then you get to Caesarea Philippi, and this is where Jesus did that chapter. And the reason it's so important, well, several reasons. First, that's where Jesus did it, but it's the main source of the Jordan River. So it's not Caesarea Philippi was not huge in the first century. It never became just a huge place. Philip the Tetrarch controlled that part, was given by the Romans, and for several hundred years, and this is where we get introduced to this concept. It's an important concept. Alexander the Great comes through Palestine in 331 BC. And he doesn't really have to conquer it. Remember Jerusalem, what did the high priest do when Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem? We were like, here it is. That, we like, and he's like, wow, impressive. That's pretty impressive. I decree that none of you will be destroyed. I mean, he saves the whole area because they came out and did that. And, because that's the way it worked. And so, but after he dies in 323 in Alexandria, down in Egypt, he has 4 generals basically that try to take over. Well, they have wars, and finally there's 2, and I've already mentioned the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. We know one of them really well. Her name was Cleopatra. She's Greek, in control of Egypt by the 1st century, right, BC, with Julius Caesar and all the rest of those characters. And so the Romans, of course, are going to conquer all of that, but in the meantime, the Greeks are controlling it. So the Greeks set up all these cities, and places like Caesarea Philippi that are very Greek in nature. They're not Jewish, they're Greek. And then the Romans take over. Now they're Greek-Roman, and they're not Jewish. But what happens when the early apostles go out with the gospel? We get Acts 10, 11, 12. What's the story in Acts 10, 11, 12? You got Cornelius, Roman centurion. The shift goes from Peter to Paul, and the gospel goes from for the Jews to for the Gentiles. So it's very obvious as we look at these pictures, when you go to Israel, it's like you got Nazareth, big Jewish city, right? And Muslims, Arabs, Jews. You got these cities and it's Jewish. You've got a bunch of these Greek ruins. And what were they before they were finally destroyed, or before they just ran out of steam, or before an earthquake hit? They were all Christian. All these Greek cities became huge Christian cities because the gospel went to the Gentiles. And it's just so cool to see that shift in the architecture and in the time period. And so Caesarea Philippi, one of the reasons why I think it's so important is because Jesus would have stood somewhere right out here in what's the ruins now. But in the 1st century, these would have been covered with 4 major temples, big temples. One temple was to Caesar Augustus, who had been the Caesar through 27 AD. One temple was to Pan, kind of the fields. One was to Zeus, kind of the big god. And one was to Nemesis, kind of like, almost like fate and retribution and all of that. And in the midst of those big temples, you see the cave right there to the left of the picture, kind of where the column's at. That's a big spring. And the waters of the Mount Hermon, all that snow, melt, come down and go subterranean and end up at this giant, it's like a cave that's really deep. The spring comes out right there, and you saw the water flowing, and that goes all the way to, becomes the Jordan River. And so this is right at the start of the Jordan River. There's these huge temples that were in existence back then to the major gods as well as Caesar. And somewhere out there, as they're all right there in that little village, that town, Jesus talks to his disciples, and what does he ask them? Who do people say I am? Who do people say I am? You know, it's difficult for us to fathom the context of a statement. But Jesus didn't just like one morning wake up in Capernaum and go, well, who do people say I am? He's actually in Caesarea Philippi, where there's all this history of the Greeks and Romans and all this stuff going on. And there's these temples. And can you hear him doing it? There's this rock. It's just this giant hill of rock. And there's all these temples. And that's where the Jordan starts. And it's just rock temples. And there's temple to Caesar over there. And Jesus is like, well, who do people say I am? And they start in. And it gives you a context of the discussion then, right? That he's not picking it out of thin air. He's actually got them a visual. He does that multiple times, right? We've talked about it before. They go down to the spring there at the bottom of the city of David, and they're carrying the water all the way up to the temple, and they're going to pour it on the altar. And that's when Jesus stands up and says, hey, you guys want to hear about some living water? And he starts his speech. Well, he's doing it within the context of that ceremony, right? And so it lends itself to, oh, wow, yeah, he's poured the water out. We have to pour it on the altar. But you're talking about something a little different. And all that's left, of course, with all of this stuff, there's kind of another view. There's the water that's coming out there, and you can see the cave. And it used to look more like this. You've got kind of over there on the far left is the one that was to Caesar Augustus, and then there's the Zeus and the Pan, and the Nemesis is over there to the right. And anyway, you know, they don't know. They're just now starting to uncover everything, kind of across the way. Like if you're standing where we're at, looking at this picture, there's the rest of the town that they're starting to uncover. It'll take years and years. But anyway, so it's Caesarea Philippi. We only have 2 minutes, so here we go. This is in Nazareth. Now we go, on the other hand, we go to Nazareth. Nazareth is where Jesus grew up. And the only thing you have in Nazareth is a modern town and giant church buildings. And so this is where they believe the angel came and told Mary that she's going to be having a baby. And so there's this huge cathedral now. And otherwise, it's a big modern, it's Nazareth. It's a big city, Jewish city, and it's just buildings and everything else. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a lot of Arabs. And actually there's a Church of Christ there. And one of our schoolmates from long ago actually came from there. He's the one that ate the leaves and got really sick because, anyway. And so, but anyway, you go to this building and it's very ornate. You walk inside. They have literally built this building on top of the ruins. So, they're very careful to do stuff like this, where there's the church building up there, and they built this thing above the ruins. So then you go down into the ruins, and it's like, well, this could have been Mary's house, and this could have been Joseph's house, and this is somebody else's house. And it's just Nazareth from the first century. And, it's not very big, because it's a little village, and very little village, right?